Thanks so much, Stefan, for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here, and excuse me for speaking English in the lecture today, and also thank you for sticking it out through nine lectures. There's one more hour to go before pizza. Anyway, thank you. In the US, it's still a widely held view that German Jews did not want to recognize anti-Semitism around them and registered its danger far too late. German Jews did not think anything could happen to them. German Jews were too tied to their fatherland, their funds, and their furniture, too blind and deluded to read the writing on the wall. German Jews were so attached to money they did not leave before it was too late. This kind of judgment has become so well established amongst US Jews that, as Deborah Lipstadt wrote some years back, if you ask a US Jew born after the Holocaust about German Jewry, you will hear some variation of the following. How could they fail to grasp what the Nazis intended to do to them? Indeed, as she went on to argue, post-Holocaust Jews point to what they consider the complacency and self-delusion of the Jews of Nazi Germany to explain why they, having learned better, speak out at the slightest expression of anti-Semitism, real or imagined. And even now you can hear jokes about the optimists going to Auschwitz. Another more charitable view still has a respectable place in the historiography, namely that after the initial shock wave of 1933, and even taking into account the codification of inferior status in the Nuremberg laws in 1935, the situation confronting Jews in the Third Reich offered a highly misleading picture as they weighed up the risks. Until 1938, Abraham Barkai wrote, a middle-class Jew with a certain amount of assets either had to have some money stashed away abroad or be possessed of a considerable degree of farsightedness in order to make the difficult decision to emigrate. Most had neither. As a result, it is only from the end of 1939 that Barkai concludes that even the most optimistic representatives of German Jewry were convinced that there were no longer any positions that could be maintained. Both of these interpretations, we would probably mostly agree, are mischaracterizations, though both allude to some part of the truth. And so the first part of my talk will briefly identify the ways in which German Jews were well aware of the anti-Semitic threat and argue that the evidence for their complacency is flawed. German Jews in general were from the beginning highly conscious of anti-Semitic policy, speech, and violence, and it's thanks to the use of Jewish sources, not least the papers of the Zentralverein, that we now know just how far the local experience in the early and mid-30s was from calm, even in the absence of major national measures, for example, in 1934. On the contrary, as we learn through Jewish eyes, symbolic, rhetorical, economic measures and a substantial dose of violence were continuing features of everyday life. At the same time, in the second part of the lecture, I want to argue that Jews in the first year of the regime found it hard to assess anti-Semitism's depth and trajectory, and that the records they've left behind are harder still for us to evaluate. For one thing, during the 1930s, early 1930s, anti-Semitism's effects were uneven, and that unevenness raised challenges of understanding for contemporaries. Particularly in the first years of Nazi rule, Jews found it hard to make out how coordinated or purposeful anti-Jewish action was. And that constituted a double problem. Jewish leaders were unsure how they should react. And that in turn led to ambiguous pronouncements. For ordinary Jews, that ambiguity in Jewish organizations' rhetoric in turn added to their own uncertainty. In the third part, I want to argue that if reading the regime as a whole was one challenge facing German Jewry, another was making sense of their neighbors. To the extent that anti-Semitic threats, policies, and pressures were ubiquitous, that ubiquitousness was in fact part of the problem. German Jews had difficulty distinguishing convinced anti-Semites from nervous fellow travelers. And when they witnessed someone clearly treating them badly, they also had difficulty thinking of them in terms of anti-Semitic belief rather than flawed character. I want to argue that at times they also did not want to see what was around them, though this, I argue, was something quite different from complacency. It was more an effort to marginalize those who were seeking to marginalize them. And what this means is that quite apart from their difficulties of discerning, parsing, and evaluating, they did not always express what was before them, and that compounds our difficulty in reading them as sources. Identifying this unwillingness to name what they saw or to see is important for understanding the psychological predicament of those facing social ostracism, but it requires us to recognize that their testimony concealed as well as revealed. On another level, however, and this is the final move in the paper argues that the failure to understand one's neighbors and thus to ascribe a clear link between beliefs and action reflects the reality that there was no simple link. Because once anti-Semitism became official policy and officially mandated violent action, our conventional understandings of prejudice leading to behavior let us down. Indeed, while they observe huge variations in behavior, the decisive experience, specifically for German Jews, as against those in occupied territory who encountered German perpetrators later, the decisive experience was the power of a societal process of great dynamism that swept many of their contemporaries along, or at least exposed them as lacking the moral anchoring to resist. So that's the terrain that I want to cover. The discovery in the 1990s in the Moscow secret archives of the records of the Zentralverein, as well as the recovery of various Zentralverein communications produced abroad, say from Nazi prying eyes, has revealed to us just how hard sections of the CV leadership had been working before 1933 to defeat the Nazis and to wake up others to the Nazi threat. And Arnold Pauker and others have analyzed this guerrilla war in the late Weimar years against anti-Semitism and the Nazis. After 1933, the CV would continue to funnel information abroad, not least via Alfred Wiener, who ran the Jewish Central Information Office in Amsterdam until his flight to London in 1939. On the ground, many Jewish observers were no less conscious of the disaster that a Nazi victory would portend and followed events that followed January 1933 with dismay. Less than a week after the seizure of power, Willi Kohn recorded the furchtbare Nachricht that a former student of his had been murdered by the SA after a Reichsbanner march. Learning a couple of weeks later that one of the student's killers had been released from detention, he famously recorded that "Nirgends ist mehr Recht in Deutschland, nirgends." In this early phase, true enough, left-wingers were the primary targets of Nazi violence, but Jewish left-wingers were the most vulnerable of all, threatened both by police action and Sturmabteilung thuggery, and many fled the country. After the elections on March 5th, Jewish observers grew even more alarmed. Was ich bis zum Wahlsonntag 5. März Terror nannte, wrote Klemperer on the 10th of March, war mildes Prälude. Reports of street violence, assaults and murders, and the lack of legal consequences were shocking. Jewish observers frequently evoked the medieval era by comparison, or like the quirky Breslau Buddhist racial Jew Walter Tausk, the 30 Years' War, conveying the profound sense that the modern world they imagined they lived in was gone. Ich habe mich wahrhaftig immer als Deutsche gefühlt, Klemperer recorded, und ich habe mir immer eingebildet, 20. Jahrhundert und Mitteleuropa sei etwas anderes als 14. Jahrhundert und Rumänien. Irrtum. Of course, the degree to which Jews were exposed in the early phase varied considerably, But those living in relative security were nonetheless deeply unsettled by incidents in more endangered areas, not least those affecting the 20% of German Jews living in small towns and villages. Despite being relieved that Hamburg was avoiding the worst, the Jewish lawyer Kurt Rosenberg assiduously chronicled the violence in Little Franconian Rothenburg, where all the Jewish men had been viciously roughed up, in Coburg, where 150 people, including 39 Jews, were held for weeks in cellars during March and April and brutally assaulted, in Gelsenkirchen, where Jewish traders had been subject to vicious attacks, and more. The threat was not just from the street. Klemperer already noted in March that it was furchtbar leichtsinnig, dies alles in mein Tagebuch zu schreiben. The following month, he added that using the telephone was now also a risk. As we know, in many locations, Nazi groups organized local boycotts of Jewish businesses. And the national boycott on April the 1st, though lasting only one day, was a profound shock for German Jews because it could no longer be written off as the action of rogue local hotheads not yet brought into a line by a responsible national government. In the meantime, economic worries were added to the security ones. The law for the restoration of the civil service on April the 7th, subsequent measures in the legal and medical fields, coupled with local boycott actions and the dismissal in many places of non-Jewish employees, began to create real economic hardship. Already in spring 1933, a third of Jewish white-collar workers were unemployed. In Berlin, where rates were even higher, half Jewish workers were jobless. As Michael Wild has shown throughout 1933 and 34, the CV chronicled the pervasive, if again regionally very unevenly distributed, acts of violence against Jews, Jewish businesses, and Jewish institutions. In Berlin, in the autumn of 1934, Hertha Nattorf noted, "Ich muss mich daran gewöhnen, Schimpfereien und Beleidigungen zu hören und nicht hinzuhorchen." And a day or two later, überall Haussuchungen, Verhaftungen. Die jüdischen Organisationen wissen sich nicht mehr zu helfen. In short, thanks to the recovery of the CV records, thanks to our greater engagement with victim and survivor testimony, we have a very different sense of the density of anti-Jewish actions, even in years in which there was no significant national legislation. Seeing through Jewish eyes has also helped us look beyond policy and violence to the power and significance of symbolic actions against Jews. Despite repeated requests to various authorities to have them banned, the Stürmerkasten became a pervasive feature of village and city life. The CV closely tracked the astonishing proliferation of anti-Semitic images in the paper, which dwarfed all other themes. Another vain effort on the CV's part, albeit with some temporary local successes in enforcing prohibition, was to stop the Hitler Youth Sturmabteilung and school groups singing songs with bloodthirsty lines against Jews. Municipalities and communes introduced arbitrary bans of every description, from banning Jews from public swimming pools, de-Judaizing street names and maps, posting Jews unwelcome signs at the entrance to the town, and so on. Local bans on flying the national colors in 1934 became national ones in spring 1935. Viewed from the CV headquarters, but also from the perspective of a great many ordinary Jews, the spread, speed, and density of anti-Semitic action was stunning. Even so, what happened did vary considerably from place to place, region to region, and that had consequences for contemporary understanding and for ours. Of course, there'd been strong regional diversity in levels of anti-Semitism long before 1933, and some of these differences carried into the Nazi years. And in the last years before the Nazis came to power, the CV had observed some areas becoming virtual no-go areas for Jews, and these rapidly became unlivable after 1933. In areas where, for example, ritual murder accusations enjoyed considerably folkloric currency, like East Prussia, the Stürmer's ritual murder accusations raised with great fanfare in 1934 enjoyed considerable resonance. In historically liberal zones like Hamburg, Jews, at least for a while, felt relatively protected, though as we saw, an observant lawyer like Kurt Rosenberg was worriedly aware of the disastrous events elsewhere. Often and increasingly, however, former regional patterns were flattened by the Nazi earthquake and new fault lines became significant. The biggest difference increasingly lay between places where Jews could be invisible and places where they could not. Invisibility might mean big cities where Jews were not known and, depending on their looks, could pass as Gentiles, or it might mean Jews in businesses where Aryan partners could transact with them away from the public eye and thus away from the fear of public shaming and retribution. In small-town Germany, where everyone knew everyone, even the formerly tolerant zones rapidly became disastrous. The Dr. Hertha Nathoff, for example, remembered the small Swabian town of Laupheim, where she grew up, as an oasis of coexistence. Niemals hatte ich in all diesen Jahren zu spüren bekommen, dass ich etwa nicht dazu gehörte oder weniger als die anderen, weil ich Jüdin war. But leaving her Berlin apartment and traveling home to attend her sister's wedding in August 1934, she experienced how sie Steine an die Fenster unseres Hauses geworfen und unsere Fest gestört haben und how Kinder auf der Straße meinem in Ehren ergrauten Vater unflätige Schimpfworte nachgerufen und die Zunge herausgestreckt haben. Old friends crossed to the other side of the street so they didn't have to say hello. And when Nathoff returned to Laupheim in 1937, it was even worse. Es war furchtbar in der kleinen Stadt, ein richtiges Spießrutenlaufen. By contrast, at least in the early years of the regime, friends from southwest Germany visiting Nathoff in Berlin felt suddenly so relaxed and unthreatened. As an aside, one of the most obvious points, I think, to disprove the claim that Jews were complacent is the huge migration from small towns to big cities to try to capture some invisibility and, of course, to benefit from the solidarity that Jewish organizations could provide there. The central report of the Jewish Welfare Organization from 1936 offered its readers for a few sample communities. By the end of 1936, the smaller communities had already lost a third to half of their pre-Nazi Jewish population. Many of the younger Jews had emigrated, but the older ones had moved to the comparative security of the big cities. But because the local experience did vary from one place to another, contemporaries were left wondering to what extent central government and national party bodies were responsible for local excesses. In the very early weeks, indeed, a number of Jews hoped that the regime might discard its radical anti-Semitic rhetoric altogether once its electoral purpose had been served. And I wish, for many reasons, that Shulamit Volkov was here today. I really regret her accident. But she wrote, amongst many wonderful things, a moving essay in which she described finding letters under the bed from her father, Otto Rudolf Hensheimer, then long after his death, letters which her mother was very reluctant to have revealed to the light of day. Her mother, they'd both been in Germany. Her mother was an Ostjude who'd been in Palestine already in the 20s. She'd come to Germany to study, and very soon after the Nazis come to power, she leaves and goes back to Palestine. But Otto Rudolf Hensheimer was a good German Jew, grew up in Baden-Baden. In 1933, he was 25 years old. He was still in Germany, and he sends letters to Shulamit's mother. Was und wie viel bindet dich hier? Was und wie viel erwartet dich hier? Gibt es für einen Juden wirklich keine Möglichkeit da, an dieser Sache mitzuarbeiten? Very striking moment. Now, most such illusions were extinguished pretty quickly. and within a couple of months, Hensheimer was in Palestine. But the Jewish Veterans Association and tiny right-wing groups like the Schwarzes Fähnlein, Max Naumann's Verband National Deutscher Juden, or the new Deutsche Vortrupp Gefolgschaft Deutsche Juden, founded in February 1933 by Hans-Joachim Schürtz, kept the fire of hope burning until 1934. If some of this was just wishful thinking, there was more rational space to imagine that concerted interventions by Jewish organizations might yet stem the tide of anti-Semitism. After all, there were some misleadingly hope-inspiring statements by both Goering and Goebbels in 1933, and it was no illusion that CEV connections within the economics ministry and elsewhere were hoping to tamp down disruptions to economic activity, both for direct economic reasons and because of the international fallout. Even in May 1934, the local Nazi with whom Victor Klemperer was hoping to sort out a housing loan condemned the lack of proportion in anti-Semitism. I'd like to see what proportional anti-Semitism looked like, but never mind. Condemned the lack of proportion in anti-Semitism and assured Klemperer that it was only the subordinate leaders who were still milking it for incitement. At the top, the leaders were trying to calm things down. It was therefore not illogical for Jewish bodies to make robust statements of national loyalty while fighting hard behind the scenes against the more outrageous local Nazi party actions, and at the same time to encourage ordinary Jews, as far as possible, not to give up positions too easily in the hope that strong reeds could break the tide until the point at which the center was really able to rein in local excesses. Until spring 1935, the CEV had some positive experiences, for example, regional police chiefs banning the singing of violently anti-Semitic songs and so on, that could lead them to think there might be success to have via this route. But then the wave of race-shame violence in spring 1935 really crushed such hopes. It's true that even in September 1935, when the announcement of the Nuremberg laws was preceded by a statement from Hitler, hoping that this laid the basis for peaceful coexistence between Germans and Jews, the Reichsassociation of German Jews, the Reichsvertretung, made a corresponding statement of goodwill. Behind the scenes, however, Jewish leaders saw that the wave of anti-Semitism was not being contained, and the Reichsvertretung's new Arbeitsprogramm, issued in 1935, acknowledged that the emerging Jewish generation would ganz überwiegend have to take the path of emigration, and declared that this would be the determining factor shaping all their work. Other than fear of reprisals, Jewish leaders had another reason for somewhat understating in public their fears of what the regime's anti-Semitism really implied, and that was that panic in the Jewish community would be counterproductive. The flight of tens of thousands across the border in 1933 into France, the Low Countries, and Switzerland had shown that escaping abroad without the means of earning a living was no long-term solution and produced only destitution, which Jewish aid bodies were ill-placed to help. Quite a few of those who fled in 1933 returned in order to get assistance at home. Even far-sighted predictors of communal extinction like Friedrich Protnitz were privately arguing in late 1934 that given global constraints, emigration could not be the solution. Thus, public statements by Jewish organizations cannot be taken at face value. One need only compare what CFR functionaries like Julius Brodnitz wrote to contacts abroad when they were on trips out of Germany and thus free of the German censor, to the public statement or even the minutes of meetings they issued from Berlin to understand this. Logical as all this was, and very far from complacency, it could be argued, as indeed some German Jews later did, that the leadership was not being entirely straight with its members, and thus to a certain extent misleading them as to the threat they faced. Those seeking reassurance might find it in the Verband's words, when there was in reality little reassurance to be had. But one should not overstate this effect. For example, some historians have argued that the Nuremberg laws, by bringing some legal clarity and ending the race, shame, violence of spring and summer 1935, reassured some Jews that anti-Semitism had been brought under control. In reality, Jewish organizations noted in the law's wake a huge uptake in consultations over emigration and felt that for the first time, emigration was being decisively constrained not by subjective reluctance to take on the risks and the costs of leaving, but by a shortage of available opportunities. Incidentally, the fall in emigration, as many of you will know, emigration peaks in 33 and then it falls, and it only surpasses the 33 level in 1938. And I think that's often misunderstood as implying a belief that things were okay. In reality, I think what it really revealed was a widespread understanding that simply leaving the country was not a good idea without prospects for earning a living. And of course, with each year, the administrative and financial obstacles to leaving were raised. Of course, it belongs to the picture that at this stage, few believed that official anti-Semitism would include mass murder. And we should remind ourselves that the regime itself did not yet know this, murderous rhetoric and fantasies notwithstanding. And particularly older Jews may well have hoped to end their days, albeit under very straitened circumstances, in Germany. But by the end of 1935, the hope that there was a real gap between radical grassroots and a rational center was largely over. In that sense, local variation, while still confusing, no longer held the misleading promise that it once had. Alongside the challenge of understanding just how anti-Semitic the regime wanted to be and where its anti-Jewish policy was headed, in some ways, a deeper mystery for ordinary German Jews was understanding the behavior of friends, acquaintances, and neighbors, and how much genuine anti-Semitism lay behind it. What was almost universal was shock at the speed with which established relationships, friendships, and acquaintanceships were disrupted or broken. Already in March 1933, following the elections, and with widespread violence at local level, changes in behavior were noticeable. True, many Jews were gratified by signs of solidarity that accompanied the boycott, but even then, caution was evident. On April the 2nd, after clipping into his diary a newspaper report of a brutal Goebbels speech at a rally the day before, Rosenberg in Hamburg captured the ambivalence of the experience. So wird von der nationalen Bewegung Hass und Widerhass Tag für Tag in Wort und Schrift einer kritiklosen Menge eingepeitscht. Viele einsichtige Leute missbilligen die Vorgänger, aber keine finden den Mut, dagegen aufzustehen. In the following months, Jews noted how those who had been willing to declare solidarity in April gradually withdrew. Implored to rejoin a coffee group that she had once frequented, Martha Appel, despite her misgivings and a sleepless night, agreed to do so and found no one there when she turned up. Already in June, as Jürgen Matthäus reminds us, long-term CV member Max Löwenstein, a lawyer from Duisburg who had lost his job as a result of the civil service law, noted in a letter to the CV head office that I had nearly totally lost contact to my non-Jewish surrounding world. There was considerable understanding of the pressures their non-Jewish peers were under. Schwerlich werden diejenigen, die unsere Tage nur noch als Geschichte erleben, erkennen können, wie tief der Zwang auf das Einzelleben wirkt, Rosenberg noted in his diary in May. Das Briefgeheimnis ist aufgehoben. In jedem Brief wägt man seine Worte. Das gesprochene Wort ist eine Gefahr, hinter der das Gefängnis steht. Überall herrscht der Zwang, Bewegungen anzugehören, die nicht der eigenen Überzeugung entsprechen. Or as Klemperer put it, aber alles, buchstäblich alles, erstirbt in Angst. Sophisticated observers of the stamp of a Klemperer or a Kohn saw the full gamut of opportunism, cowardice, and courage that prompted participation or acquiescence in the machinery. On one day in 1935, Klemperer made notes about the brave Fräulein May, who still came to visit them, the tepid Frau Kuhn, not unkind, but still believing in the idealism of the regime, and the horrible Frau Fischer, the hybrid of sheep and pig, who had cut off the dear good Kaufmanns. While naive faith in Hitler was often noted, it's rare to find anti-Semitism described as an ideological conviction, rather the function of opportunism or bad character. Victor Klemperer's recorded conversation from June 17, 1934, with his colleague Johannes Kuhn, in which the latter professed himself not to be an anti-Semite, while reproducing all the tropes about the uncreative, mobile, and derivative Jew and the creative German, is relatively unusual, both in Klemperer's diary and in German Jewish accounts more generally. One challenge facing many middle-class German Jews in making sense of the transitions after 1933 is that they'd often been hard-placed to identify the attitudes of their Gentile neighbors and colleagues before the Nazis come to power. Behind the mask of politeness, what did those close to them actually think? Using the admittedly rather rarefied example of those around Carl Schmitt, for example, Joseph Bendersky noted the cordiality and apparent warmth that Jewish members of the Frankfurt School experienced in their interactions. It would have been difficult for these young Jewish scholars and activists, Bendersky notes, to imagine the vicious anti-Semitic rants that appear in Schmitt's diaries or his true sentiments be hidden behind his outward facade of cordiality and intellectual respectability. The gap between public cordiality and private feelings was by no means unique to Schmitt. Of course, there's a limit to what any of us can see behind the public face of our neighbors. But Bendersky argued that there was also something willful about it. The sincere perception of limited anti-Semitism conveniently fitted into the social and political mental frameworks held dear by many Jews in Germany. And indeed, a fundamental challenge that we face in reading German Jewish accounts is how far they were willing to look anti-Semitism in the face, as it were, and how far they withheld from their own consciousness, or at least from their diaries and memoirs, the disturbing sentiments with which they were confronted. We can see this initially by looking at what is not said in the diaries. Consider, for example, the long periods of silence in many German Jewish diaries where there is no comment on particularly abhorrent or negative behavior. I think we can take it as read that these are not a statement about the possibility of living in Nazi Germany without directly encountering such. A few days after the Night of the Long Knives, on the 4th of July 1934, a few days after the Night of the Long Knives, Willi Cohn exclaims, "Without the brown uniforms, the street scene looks quite different from what we've been used to. Yet on that street experience, he had until then barely wasted a word." Years later, in April 1940, after a trip to the tax office, Cohn noted, "These days, you are happy to be treated well by the authorities. Yet with one or two exceptions, the authorities he described until then had been generally civilized. In other words, while the total picture painted was indeed cognizant of the threats faced by German Jews, the most hateful encounters are often excluded in the detail." In terms of Willi Cohn's encounters with officialdom, for example, most are barely even mentioned. A brief visit to the Gestapo on 22nd July 1939 is described simply as an afterthought, yet we know that visits to the Gestapo were always an alarming event for German Jews, and certainly by 1939. In Klemperer, too, until 1942, with one or two exceptions, most of the encounters with the officialdom he describes are courteous or at least correct. Even in 1940, he allowed himself to ask myself where all the wild anti-Semitism is. For my part, I encounter much sympathy. People help me out, but fearfully, of course. Yet, a year later, he cites as a given that among German Jews, people have no expectation anymore, hardly even hope of decent treatment. There is thus often a hidden but sometimes powerful undertow in German Jewish accounts, a struggle to belong and to identify that affects the way in which anti-Semitism is observed and described. Above all, even when it does make it onto the page, nasty interlocutors are often subtly or not so subtly marginalized from mainstream society. This is most evident in the diary of Walter Tausk. Tausk was Jewish by background, but a Buddhist by persuasion, living in Breslau, like Kohn. When the Nazis appear, then as throwbacks to the Middle Ages or as cloddish numbskulls, Kohn writes of the Nazi-Oten, surrounded by a population that supposedly disapproves of what they're doing. The SA and SS were worse than the hordes in the 30 Years' War, and the Middle Ages is, as I've said, a simile to which German Jews often resort. We're therefore not sure what to do with the frequent assumption in German Jewish accounts that older officials and employees were unhappy with what was being done to the Jews. In July 1933, Walter Tausk was certain that officials were keen to leave the civil service because in Silesia, this Hochburg of the party, everything was being overdone without understanding. And there are many other such examples. Even in Berlin of June 1938, officials of the Zentralverein still believed that older police officials were most unhappy with the daily street violence to which they were obliged to turn a blind eye. May be true, but the parallel evidence of police corruption at the cost of Jews at the same time makes us unsure how far it was wishful thinking. Willi Cohn's comment on 13th of November 1938, as the accounts of what had happened in Kristallnacht flowed in, that in contrast to the party, the Beamtenschaft, in this case probably the police rather than civil servants, is said everywhere to have behaved decently, was certainly fanciful, though Kohn may have been accurately reporting what other Jews were saying. So, conscious of the instinct to find reassurance wherever possible, we distrust the number of times that observers in the early years claimed that the mainstream population did not go along with the actions of the few, or that people did not really believe in what they were doing. In German Jewish accounts, radical or particularly aggressive behavior was often described in terms of an individual character attribute. It's treated as gemein, or in Elisabeth Freund's words, responding to a nasty speech by a loathsome labor exchange official, feige, cowardly, the latter term used because the official was addressing a group of Jewish women and thus unchivalrous and unmanly. Even more common is the emphasis on the Nazis as part of some rough underclass, social dregs that Hitler had allowed into positions of influence. And Tausk, again, observing the marching participants in February 1933, noted that in contrast to the conduct and forces of the Stahlhelm, I have to say, in all objectivity, that what I saw in the ranks of the SA and SS was just utter rubble, Bruch. You could not imagine coarser faces, the expression of the worst corruption and depravity. Such observations about social background shaded into ones that merely emphasized crudity, coarseness, and inherent brutality. As the essay lost significance, this plebeian note faded somewhat, but German Jews' sense of social reversal continued to be reflected in an emphasis on the radicals as representatives of lower class. This was not complacency, but it was a certain unwillingness to fully take on board what was happening around them. And now I'm coming to my final point. If German Jews' reluctance to accept the anti-Semitism of their neighbors reflected an unwillingness to accept reality at times, in other respects, it was both understandable and indeed accurately reflected reality. Understandable in the sense that the prejudices uttered by the regime made so little sense that it was hard to give them any credence. As Klemperer noted in his diary in January 1939, there was no German-Jewish question, and the solution of the Jewish question in inverted commas, could be found only in deliverance from those who had invented it. However, the fact that beliefs were irrational did not, of course, mean that they were not sincerely held by some. But at a deeper level, surely German Jewish observers were right not to see avoidance, gruffness, or worse as necessarily the product of conviction. Because once anti-Semitism became public policy and publicly declared stigma in a regime in which sanctions could include real violence, there were all sorts of reasons for acquiescence, avoidance, shame-filled distance, participation, opportunism, and perpetration. Were Jews so wrong in seeing moral cowardice, opportunism, and conformity as essential forces in the transformation of German society? At the very least, individual actions said little directly about individual belief. In terms of the most active perpetrators, after all, Joseph Wolff said that looking at their individual motivation was almost irrelevant. That was perhaps an exaggeration, but there is zero evidence that a long pedigree of anti-Semitism was a prerequisite for being a key player in making anti-Semitic policy. Look at Reinhard Heydrich, look at Gestapo Müller, look at the Vaterland's Arthur Greiser. The point was that a process was underway that was much larger than the convictions of the individual. The central shocking insight that German Jews had gained, it seems to me, was not how anti-Semitic the Germans were, but how rapidly and totally society could change. The mixture of violence, pressure, enthusiasm for Hitler, and yes, the presence of codes and tropes that made anti-Semitism something plausible, in Peter Fritzsche's words, something that people could try on and find that it fit, had created something like a collective disposition consigning Jews ever more firmly to the stigmatized margins. This disposition, held together in the dynamic force field between Hitler regime and society, was superficial in one sense, in that it would shrink back quickly as the end of the war revealed. As Klemperer and his wife passed as refugees and not Jews in the closing weeks of the war, he marveled at the speed of this reversal, just as he'd been fearfully incredulous at the speed of change in 1933. But in another sense, it was enormously powerful in providing sounding board, echo chamber, and ultimately real energy to the regime's ever more violent assault on German and then European Jewry.